Hello and welcome to ESG Talk. I'm your host, Mandi McReynolds, and we're so glad that you decided to join us today. We take insights and advice from all different environment, social, and governance leaders. And today we're going to be discussing the hot debate around ESG and shared language. Our guest today is Mark Horoszowski. He is the co-founder and CEO of MovingWorlds. Together, he wrote this incredible article on Triple Pundit. It was debate around how do we get away from name calling and shouting and not listening to how do we have a very important shared language with environment, social, and governance. And as I read the article, I thought it was very insightful. So I just sent him a cold LinkedIn request to have him come on the show and share his insights with our team and his perspective in this season. So Mark, welcome to the show.
Sure, my pleasure. I really appreciate you reaching out, and I'm happy to be here.
So let's go there with this Triple Pundit article. Can you talk with our audience about this debate of moving from name calling and shouting to some clarity and shared language? And you sort of put together these 3 or 4 different views of ESG. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think it's worth looking at, almost anything that comes out right now with ESG feels just so loaded, right? I live in the United States, right? We're seeing like backlash bills that are coming out of politicians saying like, no, we don't want any talk about ESG. We're seeing some CEOs saying, yes, we're all in on ESG. No, we're against it. We're seeing nonprofits saying ESG is great. No, it's terrible. And what is it? And what really felt like was missing in the conversation was, do we actually have a shared vision and belief that our future economy will be more sustainable, equitable, and just, right? And I actually think most people want that and are working towards that. The question is, how do we get there and when and how quickly? And I think this is where the ESG debate really starts to devolve, right? Because investors are saying, hey, we actually want to know some ESG things, like how much carbon is a company putting out? Because if a government decides to start taxing carbon emissions, investors want to factor that into their investment equation. So it's actually really important from just a financial investment perspective for investors to know what are the ESG activities of a company. And of course, environmental carbon is one of the most common, but there's social factors there, like pay inequity as an example. And then there's governance factors like, are there employees on the board or not? And so I think investors are wanting to know more and more of this so they can actually make better investment decisions. Now, that's very different from consumers or employees or the general public or a lot of nonprofits who are saying, look, we want you to care about ESG because we're tired about seeing pollution in our backyard or plastic on the waste or gross pay inequity so that people can't live close to where they work anymore, right? And so people, employees, consumers, they have a very different demand and desire for ESG. And they get really frustrated when they just see an investor saying, yeah, but we don't care about all that stuff. We just care about this. And the reality is both situations are true, right? And then governments are under increased pressure to respond to largely ideally a citizen demand, but also the lobbying efforts that are influencing them. And so governments are saying, hey, we want to help bring some clarity and consistency here. And we also need to make some improvements into the way that we are measuring on some of these things so that we can also accomplish some of our governmental objectives, right? So those are regulatory. So what we have here there are investor demands. Let's call that assurance, right? That's the old auditor in me. There's the government demand. Let's call that regulation. And then there's the employee and the consumer and the kind of general community. And that's the impact, right? And so I think what's important is that we're actually having all of these conversations. And I think we'd be a lot farther along if instead of an impact-driven person and a assurance-driven person arguing over the term ESG, but rather they could sit there and more clearly state, as an investor, I need this information to make investment decisions, right? And as a consumer or as a citizen, I want these things, for the sake of my children or my community or what it is, right? And then I actually think there's actually a lot more shared that we have in these dialogues than we have that actually pulls us apart. Unfortunately, with news cycles right now, we're seeing a lot more of that division, though.
So, Mark, you were at Davos this year and you got to experience the change of language there, where ESG was barely used, I think once on the agenda, and climate was over 100 times. How do you think this language change is going to impact the future direction of ESG?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And, I think what we saw at Davos was not that there wasn't the core concepts of ESG there, but the language being used around it, right? Here we are back at that kind of language terminology, right? I'll use Larry Fink as an example, right? The CEO of BlackRock, one of the biggest asset managers in the world. He lamented that he's being blasted from the impact ESG folks, right? Because they're not doing enough, right? And I really identify with that, right? I can see why an impact oriented person would be very frustrated with still some of BlackRock's investment activities and how they act as, board members in many of their investments. Now, on the other side, the more kind of, let's say, conservative free market side, right? A lot of investors are saying, no, you're actually doing too much, right? And we actually want you to kind of rein it in and do less, right? We just want more disclosure. We don't want you to actually decide what is right or not. You are an asset manager, not an expert in environmental sustainability and social equality. And then you have regulators, right? Some that are in favor of some of these moves and some that are actually saying, we actually have a lot of constituents that don't like it. So be careful. And some, in fact, governments have pulled money out of BlackRock. So, here's Larry Fink saying, I'm not doing enough to appease the impact folks. I'm actually getting into dangerous water with regulators. And then investors are actually not liking some of the things that I'm pushing. So where do I go? What do I do from here? Right? Now, within the system that he operates, he's going to lean towards that investment and that regulation crowd. Right now, in the long run, though, he still needs to bring the impact folks. And I think that, in a way, kind of represents what we were seeing at Davos was we need to set the stage for the long-term transition to a more sustainable and equitable economy. Many people, myself included, don't think we're doing it fast enough. But we also have to understand the system that we're operating in today. And so I think for that reason, we just saw ESG being used more sparingly because of the intensity and some of the dialogue being used around it. But what I will say is that I was in kind of private closed door meetings with CFOs of very, very large companies, and they were talking about it, right? They were talking about sustainability. They were talking about social equity. They were talking about the advantages of financing some of these activities and in performing well, right? If they perform well, they actually have access to lower cost of capital, which is good for their bottom line, which is good for their investors, which is good for their employees and their consumers. So it's definitely alive, but I think for language purposes, they're staying away from ESG and they're leaning towards like climate tech, climate innovation, because that's really like one of the big buzzwords right now. And a lot of Davos is around, kind of some PR work in motion. So I think people were just being careful with their language, but as a topic, all of those core concepts were very, very much on the table in pretty much every conversation I was a part of.
Well, and I think there's a good moment to take a pause. An earlier episode in season 1 talked about backlash. And I was like, how do you deal with backlash? I'm like, you stay true to your business value drivers and you stay true to your strategy. I also think it's really important when we unpack that investor side is you said the word very well. And this season's all about perspective. So you on the impact side, I'm going to lean a little bit on that finance side for a different perspective is when I see governments working through those issues of fiduciary responsibility, it's also about the transition of economies. And so their concern is the transition of economies. And when you sit with those legislators and decision makers, similar to the CEOs looking at their transition, they're looking at the same. Well, what happens if all these businesses collapse in my state? What happens if we don't have enough alpha return for the pension funds we need, for our constituents? Yeah. And those are very challenging and difficult conversations to have in a transition of economy and of work. And so I often look at that and say we all have to work together to have a little bit more perspective taking and a little less hot taking. Sure. What's going to get clickbait today? Because behind closed doors, I think what you found with CEOs, and I find this with legislators and regulators, is they're very reasonable people.
Yep.
Like they really are. And what doesn't often get picked up is that reasonableness of what they're trying to achieve together. So there's a little bit of perspective there. I want to lean in because both of our organizations do great work with the UN SDGs. You focus on social enterprise and really these shifting conversations from climate to sustainability, the risk of the S and the G if it doesn't happen. So tell us, what do you really see as those risks if companies don't figure out that transition plan with the S and the G in mind?
One of the favorite kind of takeaways or things that I heard from Davos was the debate and the discussion is not where we're going, but how to get there, right? I think even the most like ardent free market capitalists that are against any type of regulation, most of them actually do believe that we are moving to a more sustainable economy that includes a greater portion of the world's population at an equitable level where you don't have gross inequalities so that some people can't participate in the formal economy, right? And there's so much research, and I think again, even the most like libertarian, money driven folks out there still actually believe that it is healthy for planet and people and their profits to include more of humanity in an equitable way, right? The question is, how do we get there and whose responsibility, really is that? And so I think if we, kind of based on that, and then to answer your question of like, okay, so then like, what is happening with the S? What is happening with the G? Like, where are these things going, and what are companies doing? I think what you're looking at is an elevation of the conversation from sustainability for sustainability's sake, but sustainability. So let me put that into that like environmental part of the conversation, social equity and governance, not just for their own sakes, not just to meet some type of regulatory requirement, but actually to fuel the business model of the future, right? And I think that that's the conversation where the most forward thinking like CEOs and CFOs are looking right now. They're saying, if, you know, I'll use a beer company, right? If we want to make beer in the future, we need to figure out how to use less fresh water and waste less fresh water. We need to figure out how to get higher quality grains consistently, regardless of issues in planetary supply chains, right? There's all these things that we have to do. And if we think about what the future looks like, we know that those things need to come from places that are paying people fair wages, that are being done in a regenerative way so that we'll have crops next year, that we can continue to reuse as much water as possible, because these are also lowering our costs. And once they lower our costs and we're able to attract more investors that care about this, we're also able to access capital at a lower cost. So a lower cost of capital, which is like every CFO's dream, right? So I think the conversation on all of these are happening, and they're starting to elevate more into the CEO and the CFO conversations. And actually, just over this weekend, I was reading a new report from EY that issued a new kind of CEO's perspectives on like what are the big trends, right? Of course, there's talk about recession, and what else is there talk about? ESG, and they actually did use those characters, and they emphasize that same point. The sustainability leaders need to become more integrated with the activities of the CFO as well. So I think that's really the big thing that we're seeing here is people saying this is not a regulation requirement. It's not something I have to do just to appease a couple investors, but actually we are, and we do believe in this business, what business will look like in the future. And we're using this as a lever to get there and to get there ahead of our competitors, right? And so do I wish they were doing more faster? Absolutely. But I'm really liking to hear like, hey, we need to do this faster than our competitors now. It feels like that's going to spur more innovation and more activity.
Well, and riffing on that a little bit, I looked deep into the S discipline, which I think is up for a big awakening. We've had a lot of years of measurement in the E, and you lean in there, and there's some ideas of how that impacts your business. When you look down into the S discipline, it's the same as true. And so when I think about that, I think about working with companies in previous roles where we looked at the cliff effect. And the cliff effect was that if somebody in our employee center took a 15-cent raise, they would lose all of their childcare benefits from the state. And so, but what happened was businesses were like, we've got really great employees that we want to maintain and grow and be on a sustainable pathway for our future workforce. So we all got together, did advocacy work and worked together with our local United Way, shared that policy work and talked about this is an economic issue.
Yeah.
Childcare is an economic issue for our businesses, and we have to go there. I also think things like that, as well as things like what is the economic impact of your business in your societies of which you're a part? What is the economic return of the products that you offer to communities or businesses? Those things are going to start to come into a microscope in the next 18 months. And you think E is coming at the forefront. I'm like, S is quickly coming behind, and you have to start to tick and talk, not just the nice stories, but the actual return on sustainable investment in the S space too. So that could be like 10 more shows
Sure.
for
Yeah,
us
that
to
resonates. Yeah, sign
cover.
me up. Yeah, I'd love to be on those conversations.
So as the CEO of MovingWorlds, you do this. You convene partners and you bring people together to have some stories. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how our audience around the world might get involved with your organization?
Sure. And thank you for sharing the story that you just did. I know that wasn't like any part of the pre-notes at all, but it really resonated. And I think it really ties a lot of what I think this talk and that article that we published in Triple Pundit was all about, right? Is we are working on systems level challenges right now, right? If we want to actually have a more environmentally sustainable, socially equitable, and just economy, one company can't just like make some change and it's there, right? One nonprofit, one government. They actually have to work together. And rule number one of systems change is actually creating a shared language, right? And I think that's kind of what really sparked us here to go forward. And so what we do with MovingWorlds is we partner up with companies that are working to achieve their own ESG goals and targets by educating and engaging their employees across the workforce, right? So that they can engage, they can learn, and at scale, they can actually start to connect to other organizations that are also working to support systems change. They can connect and use their skills and time to support nonprofits. They can volunteer their skills with social enterprises and startups for positive impact. They can even connect with universities or other institutions to help them, again, all kind of build up these pieces to support systems change at a broader level. So we're really fortunate to partner with some great companies like Unilever, EY, SAP, and others that are sponsoring their employees to learn more about these topics and then to actually engage directly with practitioners who are building the future of business, right? Who are building socially and environmentally sustainable business models and supply chains, right? And they help these social enterprises around the world build capacity and then actually plug in to their corporate supply chains, however they can find footholds, as well as through their partners. And then on the other side, right, we operate a global acceleration network for social entrepreneurs and startups for positive impact that can access learning, community, and this global network of professionals from around the world who are working to help them find inroads into corporate supply chains, who are helping them find new business opportunities, and are also helping them build the actual capacity and systems and processes and products to actually deliver on some of these targets.
Well, thank you so much for your organization's incredible work on connectivity and shared language and shared system changes with innovation infused in to help answer and meet some of those challenges. I know this time went very, very fast as we covered a lot of topics. And for those listening in, don't worry, we're not changing the show name. It's still going to be ESG Talk as moving forward, but also recognize that the term has opportunity to pull people in from different stakeholders as we think about our regulators, our investors, our customers, and communities of which we are part around the world. So we look forward to continuing to deliver these wonderful perspectives in season 2. Follow us wherever and subscribe wherever you have your podcast. We'll have in the show notes some resources from Mark and his team for you to check out. And as we continue, let's talk real soon.
Cool. Mandi, thanks so much for having me.